I never thought a dusty old attic would be the place where my entire life would unravel. But there I was 3 weeks after Mom's funeral, sorting through boxes of Christmas decorations and forgotten photo albums, when I found it. A leather-bound journal tucked inside a hatbox, hidden beneath layers of tissue paper that had yellowed with age. The moment I opened it and saw my mother's handwriting, delicate and looping across the first page, I knew I was holding something I was never meant to find. "If you're reading this," the first entry said, "then I'm gone, and perhaps it's time the truth finally came out." My hands trembled as I turned the page. I had no idea that the next few hours would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. The diary dated back 35 years to a time before I was born, when my mother was just a young woman of 23. But what stopped my heart cold was the entry dated 6 months before my birth. "I've decided to keep the baby," she wrote. "Even though Richard isn't the father. I pray he never finds out. I pray Emily never finds out. Some secrets are meant to protect the people we love, even if they destroy us in the process." The journal slipped from my fingers and hit the wooden floor with a thud that echoed through the empty house. Richard, my father, the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and walked me down the aisle at my wedding, wasn't my biological father. And from the tortured pages that followed, it was clear my mother had carried this secret like a stone around her neck for my entire life. I sat there on the attic floor for what felt like hours, reading page after page of confessions that grew darker with each entry. My mother wrote about her affair with a man named James Thornton, a colleague at the law firm where she worked as a paralegal. She described him as charismatic, ambitious, and dangerous. A man who made her feel alive in ways my father never could, but who also manipulated and controlled her in ways that left scars she never showed the world. When she discovered she was pregnant, James wanted her to terminate the pregnancy. He was married, climbing the corporate ladder, and a scandal would ruin everything he'd built. But my mother refused. She broke off the affair and returned to my father, letting him believe the baby was his. "Richard is a good man," she wrote. "He'll be a wonderful father. Emily will never know the poison that runs through her veins, and that's the greatest gift I can give her." But the secrets didn't end there. As I continued reading, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages, I discovered that my father, Richard, had known the truth all along. He discovered the affair when I was just 2 years old, confronted my mother in their bedroom one night after finding love letters hidden in her closet. But instead of leaving, instead of demanding a paternity test or throwing us out, he'd made a choice. He said he would stay. My mother wrote, her handwriting jagged with emotion. He said it didn't matter whose blood ran through Emily's veins, she was his daughter, and he would never let her know otherwise. But the look in his eyes when he said it broke something inside me. I saw the hurt, the betrayal, and I knew our marriage would never be the same. He stayed out of duty, not love. And every day since then has been a performance. A carefully constructed lie to protect a child who deserves so much better than parents who can barely look at each other without remembering what was lost. The revelations kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. My mother wrote about my grandmother, my father's mother, the woman I'd called Grandma Ruth until her death 5 years ago, and how she discovered the truth as well. Ruth had never forgiven my mother for the betrayal. She'd spent years making subtle digs, undermining my mother's authority, and poisoning my father against her in ways so subtle that I'd never noticed. She calls me a whore when Richard isn't around, my mother wrote when I was 10. She tells me I trapped her son, that I'm lucky he stayed, that Emily will grow up to be just like me, a liar and a manipulator. I want to fight back, to defend myself, but how can I? Everything she says is true. I did trap Richard. I did lie. And every day I look at Emily's face and see James Thornton's eyes staring back at me, and I know I can never tell her the truth. I looked up from the diary, my vision blurred with tears, and caught my reflection in an old mirror leaning against the attic wall. My eyes, I'd always thought they were an unusual shade of green, different from both my parents' brown eyes. I joked about being the mailman's daughter, never knowing how close to the truth that joke actually was. The diary slipped from my lap as I pressed my hands to my face, trying to process the enormity of what I just learned. My father wasn't my father. My mother had been living a lie for 35 years. My grandmother had been cruel because she knew the truth. And somewhere out there was a man named James Thornton who had no idea, or perhaps didn't care, that he had a daughter. I forced myself to pick up the diary again, to keep reading even though every word felt like a knife to my chest. The later entries revealed more uncomfortable truths about my family. My brother Michael, my younger brother by 3 years, had apparently been the result of my mother's desperate attempt to give my father a real child, a biological son who would somehow make up for her betrayal. Richard barely touches me anymore, she wrote when I was 5. But I convinced him we should try for another baby. I thought maybe if I gave him a son, a child who was truly his, he might forgive me. He might love me again. The entry dated 9 months later, just after Michael's birth, was even more heartbreaking. He loves Michael in a way he could never love Emily, and I hate myself for being relieved. At least one of my children is truly his. At least one of them won't grow up feeling the distance I've created in this family. The words stung because they explained so much. My father had always been different with Michael. More patient, more present, more openly affectionate. I chalked it up to Michael being the baby of the family, or perhaps because they were both male and shared interests I didn't have. But now I understood. My father had been keeping his distance from me my entire life, not because he didn't love me, but because every time he looked at me, he saw my mother's betrayal. He saw James Thornton. And no matter how much he tried to be the father he'd promised to be, there was always that wall between us, invisible but impenetrable. I spent the rest of that day in the attic reading through 35 years of my mother's secret pain. She wrote about the guilt that ate at her daily, the fear that I would somehow discover the truth and hate her for it. She wrote about the moments when she almost told me. My high school graduation, my wedding day, the birth of my first child, but couldn't bring herself to destroy the illusion of our happy family. Emily thinks we had a good marriage, she wrote in one of her final entries, dated just 3 months before her death. She thinks Richard and I loved each other until the end. She tells her friends how lucky she is to come from such a stable, loving home. I let her believe it because the truth would destroy her. But I'm tired, so tired of carrying this weight. Sometimes I think about writing everything down, leaving it somewhere she'll find it after I'm gone. At least then she'll understand why things were the way they were. At least then she'll know her mother wasn't cold and distant because she didn't love her, but because she loved her too much to tell her the truth. When I finally emerged from the attic, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost cruel in their beauty. How could the world look so normal when everything I knew had just been torn apart? I walked through my childhood home in a daze, seeing it with new eyes. The family photos on the walls, my father holding me as a baby, his smile tight and uncomfortable. The living room where we'd celebrated Christmas mornings, where my father would sit in his chair reading the paper while my mother bustled around making sure everything was perfect, the two of them rarely speaking directly to each other. The kitchen where my grandmother Ruth would corner my mother when she thought no one was listening, her voice low and venomous. How had I missed it all? How had I been so blind? I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The secrets my mother had buried were too big, too destructive to stay hidden. They'd poisoned my family for decades, creating distance and hurt that had shaped all of us in ways we didn't understand. My father had spent 33 years raising a child who wasn't his biological daughter, never once letting on that he knew the truth, that deserved acknowledgement, even if it meant exposing the lie we'd all been living. And Michael deserved to know why our father had always treated him differently, why there had always been this invisible division in our family. And I deserved answers. I deserved to know who I really was, where I came from, and whether the man whose DNA I carried had any interest in knowing I existed. But more than anything, I was angry. Angry at my mother for creating this situation, and then leaving me to deal with the fallout. Angry at my father for playing along with the lie instead of insisting on honesty. Angry at my grandmother for being cruel to my mother instead of helping our family heal. And yes, angry at myself for being so naive, for never questioning the dynamics that now seem so obvious in hindsight. That anger is what drove me down from the attic, diary clutched in my hands like evidence at a trial, and made me pick up my phone. I called my father first. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Emily, sweetheart. How's the house sorting going?" I couldn't bring myself to ease into it, to make small talk when my entire world had just shattered. "Dad, I found Mom's diary in the attic. I know about James Thornton. I know everything." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear my father breathing, could almost see him sitting in his living room, the color draining from his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I see." Those 2 words carried the weight of 33 years of secrets. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You, me, and Michael. It's time everything came out in the open." My father was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if he would refuse, if he would try to maintain the lie even now that it had been exposed. But finally he sighed. A sound so heavy with resignation that it made my heart ache despite my anger. "You're right," he said. "It's past time. I'll call Michael. Come over tomorrow morning. We'll talk about everything." That night I barely slept. I lay in my childhood bedroom. I'd been staying at the house while sorting through my mother's belongings, staring at the ceiling and replaying every memory through the lens of this new information. Birthday parties where my father seemed to hover at the edges, present but distant. Family vacations where my parents barely spoke to each other. My wedding day, when my father had walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and I'd thought it was just normal father of the bride emotion. Now I wondered if he'd been crying because he was saying goodbye to the little girl he'd raised as his own, knowing that someday the truth might come out and change everything between us. Had he loved me despite everything? Or had every moment of fatherhood been a burden he'd carried out of obligation? The next morning, I drove to my father's house with the diary on the passenger seat, its presence as heavy as a bomb. Michael's car was already in the driveway when I arrived. My brother met me at the door, his face etched with confusion and worry. "Emily, what's this about? Dad wouldn't tell me anything over the phone. Just said it was urgent." I looked past him to where our father sat in the living room, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He'd aged 10 years overnight, his face gray and haggard, his shoulders slumped with the weight of decades of secrets. "It's about Mom," I said quietly, stepping inside. "It's about our family. It's about the truth." We sat in my father's living room, the 3 of us, and I placed the diary on the coffee table between us like evidence in a trial. My father stared at it as if it were a snake coiled and ready to strike. Michael looked between us, his confusion deepening into alarm. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I told them everything I'd read about James Thornton, about my mother's affair, about the fact that the man sitting across from me wasn't my biological father. I watched Michael's face shift from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like understanding. I watched my father's eyes fill with tears he didn't bother to hide. And I felt something inside me break and reform. A painful restructuring of my entire identity. "I've known since you were 2 years old," my father said when I finished, his voice rough with emotion. "I found the letters. I confronted your mother. We almost divorced. I had already called a lawyer, started the paperwork. But then I looked at you sleeping in your crib and I couldn't do it. You were my daughter. I'd raised you from birth. I'd been there for your first word, your first steps. The idea of not being your father anymore, of walking away from you because of something that wasn't your fault, I couldn't do it." He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so vulnerable it made my chest ache. "So I stayed. I told your mother we would never speak of it again, that as far as I was concerned you were mine, and that was the end of it." "But it wasn't the end of it, was it?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "Because you treated me differently my entire life. You were always more distant with me than with Michael. I always felt like I was somehow not quite good enough, like there was this wall between us I couldn't break through. And now I know why." My father flinched as if I'd struck him, and the pain in his eyes was genuine. "I tried," he said quietly. "God, Emily, I tried so hard to treat you the same, to not let it affect how I felt about you. But every time I looked at you, especially as you got older and started to look more like him, it was hard. I'm not proud of that. I'm ashamed of it. But I never stopped being your father. I never stopped loving you, even when it hurt." Michael had been silent through this exchange, his face pale and his hands clenched in his lap. Now he spoke, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "So that's why you always pushed me so hard," he said, looking at our father. "That's why you had all these expectations for me that you never had for Emily. I always thought you were being sexist, that you expected more from your son than your daughter. But it wasn't that, was it? You needed me to be enough. You needed me to make up for her. The way he said her, with such venom, made me recoil. Michael, I started, but he cut me off. Do you have any idea what it was like growing up as the good child? He demanded. The one who had to excel at everything, who had to be perfect, who couldn't make mistakes because I was carrying the weight of Dad's dreams. I thought it was just because I was the son, the one who would carry on the family name. But no, it was because I was the real child. The legitimate one. The one whose existence somehow justified Mom's betrayal. That's not fair, my father said, his voice sharp with a force I rarely heard from him. I never thought of either of you that way. Yes, I knew Emily wasn't biologically mine, but she was still my daughter. And yes, maybe I put too much pressure on you, Michael, but that was my failing as a father, not Emily's fault. She never asked for any of this. But Michael was standing now, pacing the length of the living room like a caged animal. Do you know what Mom told me? He asked, and his voice cracked. Right before she died, when she was in the hospital and barely conscious from all the medication, she grabbed my hand and said, "Take care of your father and your sister. You're the only real family she has." I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I thought she was just confused from the drugs. But she was telling me, wasn't she? She was confessing in her own way. The room fell silent. None of us had known about that moment, that deathbed confession that wasn't quite a confession. My mother, even at the very end, couldn't bring herself to tell the full truth. She could only hint at it, leaving cryptic messages and hidden diaries for us to piece together after she was gone. It was so typical of her. The woman who had spent her entire life managing perceptions and maintaining the facade of normalcy, even as everything crumbled beneath the surface. I need to know who he is, I said, breaking the silence. James Thornton. I need to know who my biological father is. I need to understand where I came from. My father, Richard, looked at me with such pain in his eyes that I almost took the words back. Almost. Are you sure? He asked. Emily, knowing his name won't change anything. I'm still the man who raised you. I'm still your father in every way that matters. I knew he was right, but it didn't change the gnawing need inside me to understand this missing piece of myself. I know you're my dad, I said softly. Nothing will ever change that. But I need to know the truth. All of it. I've spent 35 years living a lie, and I can't do it anymore. Please, help me find him. What followed were weeks of research, of awkward phone calls and uncomfortable conversations. My father finally broke his silence and told me everything he knew about James Thornton. He'd worked at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious law firm in Chicago, back when my mother was a paralegal there in the late 80s. He'd been a rising star, a man with political ambitions and the ruthlessness to achieve them. When my father had confronted my mother all those years ago, she told him that James had moved to New York, that he'd made partner at a firm there and was completely out of our lives. She'd sworn she never contacted him again, never told him about my birth, never asked him for anything. Whether that was true or not, we would never know for certain. But I had a name, and in the age of the internet, a name was enough. It took me 3 days to find him. James Thornton wasn't hard to track down. He'd become exactly what he'd wanted to be. He was now a federal judge, appointed 5 years ago, with a sterling reputation and a wife who came from old money. He had 2 sons, both in their 20s, both following in his footsteps into law. He had the life he'd wanted, the life my mother's pregnancy had threatened to destroy. And looking at his picture on the federal court website, seeing those green eyes that matched mine exactly, I felt a surge of something between rage and grief. This man had given me life and then walked away from it without ever looking back. This man had threatened my mother, pressured her to end her pregnancy, and then disappeared into his perfect life while she struggled with the consequences of their affair for the rest of her days. I hired a private investigator to dig deeper, to find out if there was any way James Thornton knew about me. What the investigator discovered was both vindicating and devastating. Shortly after my birth, my mother had sent James a letter with a photo of me as a newborn. The letter was brief. You have a daughter. Her name is Emily. I'm not asking for anything from you. Not money, not acknowledgement, not a relationship. I just thought you should know she exists. Richard is raising her as his own, and she'll never know about you unless you want her to. But she's here. She's real. And she's beautiful." The letter had been sent to his office at the law firm in New York. According to the paper trail my investigator uncovered, it had been received and logged. But James had never responded. He'd simply thrown it away and moved on with his life. That was what broke me. Not the affair, not the lies, not even the 35 years of pretending. It was the knowledge that my biological father had been given a chance to acknowledge my existence, and he'd chosen not to. He'd looked at a picture of his newborn daughter and decided she wasn't worth the risk to his career, his marriage, his carefully constructed life. He discarded me as easily as he'd discarded that letter, and he'd never looked back. I sat in my living room with the investigator's report spread out before me, and I cried harder than I'd cried since my mother's funeral. I cried for the little girl who'd always felt like something was missing but never knew why. I cried for my mother, who'd carried this burden alone for so long. I cried for my father, my real father Richard, who'd stayed and loved me despite everything. And I cried for myself, for the woman I was now, trying to rebuild her identity from the shattered pieces of a lifetime of lies. But crying wasn't enough. I needed to do something, to take action, to stop being a passive victim of my family's secrets. So I made a decision that I knew would change everything. I was going to confront James Thornton. I was going to walk into his perfect life and force him to acknowledge that I existed, that I was his daughter, and that his choices had consequences. My father, Richard, begged me not to do it. "Emily, what do you think you'll accomplish?" he asked when I told him my plan. The man didn't want to be a father 35 years ago. He won't want to be one now. All you'll do is hurt yourself and potentially destroy his family, who have nothing to do with this. But I was past listening to reason. "His family has everything to do with this," I shot back. "I'm his family. I'm his daughter. And if his wife and sons don't know I exist, then they're living the same lie I've been living my whole life. They deserve to know the truth just as much as I did." Michael surprisingly supported my decision. He'd spent the week since our revelation going through his own crisis of identity, questioning everything about our childhood and our family dynamics. "Do it," he said when I called to tell him my plan. "Blow up his perfect life the way Mom and Dad's secrets blew up ours. He deserves to face the consequences of what he did. And maybe when you do it you'll get some closure. Some answers. Something to help make sense of this mess." So with my brother's blessing and my father's reluctant acceptance, I set about planning my confrontation with James Thornton. I learned his schedule from public records. Federal judges' calendars are mostly public information. I learned where he lived, where he worked, where he went to church on Sundays with his wife and adult sons. I learned everything I could about this man who was a stranger to me but whose DNA I carried, whose eyes looked back at me from the mirror every morning. And when I finally felt ready, when I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say 1,000 times in my head, I drove 3 hours to the courthouse where James Thornton presided over cases with the authority and gravitas that came from a lifetime of success built on carefully hidden secrets. I waited in the public gallery of his courtroom for 2 hours, watching him work. He was impressive, I had to admit, commanding and articulate, with a sharp legal mind that cut through arguments with surgical precision. He was fair in his rulings, patient with the attorneys, respectful to the jury. He was everything a judge should be. And he was my father. The cognitive dissonance of those two facts existing simultaneously made my head spin. This was the man who'd pressured my mother to terminate her pregnancy. This was the man who'd thrown away a picture of his newborn daughter without a second thought. This was the man whose abandonment had shaped my entire life in ways I was only beginning to understand. And now here he was, dispensing justice, making decisions that affected people's lives, acting as if he had the moral authority to judge others when his own past was built on cowardice and betrayal. When the court adjourned for lunch, I made my move. I waited in the hallway outside his chambers, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When he emerged, flanked by a law clerk and looking at his phone, I stepped directly into his path. "Judge Thornton," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I need to speak with you. It's about Patricia Morrison." I'd used my mother's maiden name deliberately, knowing her married name wouldn't mean anything to him. He looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to polite interest. "I'm afraid I don't," he started, but then he really looked at me. My eyes met mine, and I watched the color drain from his face. He knew. In that instant, looking at my face, seeing his own features reflected back at him, he knew exactly who I was. "I think we should talk in private," I said quietly, aware of the law clerk hovering nearby, of the other people in the hallway who might overhear. James recovered quickly. A lifetime of controlling his reactions in courtrooms had taught him well. "Janet, I need to reschedule my lunch meeting," he said to the clerk without taking his eyes off me. "Something urgent has come up." The clerk looked between us, sensing the tension, but nodded and retreated. James gestured to his chambers. "Please come in." His office was exactly what I'd expected. Mahogany furniture, shelves lined with legal volumes, framed degrees and honors covering the walls. It was the office of a man who'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. And I was about to destroy it all. "You're Patricia's daughter," James said once the door was closed. It wasn't a question. He stood behind his desk, not sitting, maintaining the physical barrier between us. "I'm your daughter," I corrected. "My name is Emily Morrison Harper. I'm 35 years old. I'm married with 2 children of my own. And until 3 months ago, I had no idea you existed." James closed his eyes for a long moment, his hand gripping the back of his leather chair until his knuckles went white. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into something cold and defensive. "I'm assuming Patricia recently passed away, and you found some letter or diary. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't see what you expect from me at this point." The coldness in his voice ignited the anger I'd been trying to keep in check. "What do I expect?" I asked, my voice rising. "How about acknowledgement? How about the basic human decency of admitting that you have a daughter you've ignored for 35 years? How about an apology for pressuring my mother to terminate her pregnancy, for abandoning her when she needed you, for throwing away the letter she sent you with my picture and never even bothering to find out if I was okay?" James's expression flickered. Surprised that I knew about the letter, maybe a hint of guilt, but he quickly regained his composure. "That was a long time ago," he said stiffly. "I was young, ambitious, and yes, I made choices I'm not proud of. But your mother and I agreed that Richard would raise you as his own. I respected that decision. I stayed away because that's what was best for everyone involved." "Best for everyone?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Best for you, you mean? You got to walk away without any consequences. You got your judgeship, your perfect family, your sterling reputation. Meanwhile, my mother spent 35 years carrying the guilt of what happened. My father, my real father, Richard, spent 33 years raising another man's child and trying to pretend it didn't hurt him. I spent my entire life feeling like something was wrong, like I didn't quite fit in my own family, and never knowing why. But sure, I'm so glad your life worked out well for you." James's jaw tightened. "What is it you want, Emily?" "Money. Because I'm prepared to." "I don't want your money." I cut him off, disgusted. "I want you to acknowledge that I exist. I want you to tell your wife and your sons that you have a daughter from an affair. I want them to know the truth about who you really are, not this perfect image you've spent decades constructing." The blood drained from his face again. "You can't do that," he said, and now there was fear in his voice. "My family, they don't know about any of this. It would destroy them. It would destroy everything I've built." "Welcome to my world," I said coldly. "That's exactly what finding my mother's diary did to me. It destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself. So forgive me if I don't have a lot of sympathy for the destruction you're facing." James moved around his desk, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Please, Emily. I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But think about what you're doing. My wife, my sons, they're innocent in all this. They don't deserve to have their lives torn apart because of mistakes I made 35 years ago. And I deserve to spend 35 years not knowing who my real father was?" I countered. "Did my mother deserve to spend her entire life carrying your secret? Did Richard deserve to raise your child while you went on with your perfect life?" I pulled out my phone, the investigator's report ready to be shared. "I came here to give you a choice, Judge Thornton. You can tell your family yourself or I can tell them. But either way, the truth is coming out. You don't get to hide anymore. The next hour was one of the most intense of my life. James alternated between pleading, threatening, and finally breaking down. When the threats didn't work, he realized quickly that threatening a woman who'd already lost everything wasn't effective. And the pleading fell on deaf ears. He finally crumbled. He sat in his leather chair, his face in his hands, and for the first time looked like a human being rather than a judge in robes. I was terrified, he said quietly. When Patricia told me she was pregnant, I was terrified. I was married, I was being considered for junior partner. I had everything I'd worked for finally within reach. A scandal would have destroyed it all. So I made the cowardly choice. I told myself I was doing what was best for everyone, that you'd be better off with Richard as your father. But the truth is, I was just protecting myself. It was the most honest thing he'd said since I'd walked into his office, and it deflated some of my anger. Not all of it. Nothing could erase 35 years of absence, but some. Why didn't you respond to my mother's letter? I asked, my voice softer now. She gave you a chance to be involved, even if it was just acknowledgement. Why did you throw it away? James looked up at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. Because I was a coward, he said simply. Because every time I thought about responding, I talked myself out of it. I told myself you were better off without me, that I would only complicate your life. But really, I was just protecting my own comfortable existence. And then years passed, and it became easier to pretend it never happened, to compartmentalize it as a mistake from my past that had no bearing on my present. I'm sorry, Emily. I know that's not enough, but I am genuinely sorry. We sat in his office for another hour talking for the first time. James told me about his life, his family, the choices he'd made and the regrets he carried. I told him about growing up always feeling like I didn't quite belong, about discovering the truth in my mother's diary, about the pain of realizing that the man who raised me had been carrying the knowledge of my true parentage as a burden for most of my life. We didn't resolve everything, that would have been impossible. But we started something. We started the process of acknowledging the truth and dealing with its consequences. And when I finally left his office, I had his promise that he would tell his wife and sons about me. That he would finally stop hiding from the consequences of his choices 35 years ago. The fallout from that meeting rippled through both our families in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. True to his word, James told his wife and sons about me. His wife was devastated. Their marriage had apparently been strong, or so she thought, and discovering this 35-year-old betrayal shattered her trust. His sons were confused and angry, struggling to reconcile the father they knew with the man who had fathered and abandoned a child before they were born. But something unexpected happened. After the initial shock wore off, they wanted to meet me. James's younger son, David, reached out through James's lawyer with a cautious email. I don't know exactly what to say, he wrote. But I have a sister I never knew about, and I'd like to get to know her if she's willing. None of this is your fault, and you deserve to be part of the family, even if the circumstances that brought you into it were complicated. That email made me cry for an hour. It was the acknowledgement I'd been seeking. Not just from James, but from the family that shared my DNA. The family I'd never known I had. We arranged to meet for coffee, David and his brother Nathan and me, in a neutral location halfway between our cities. It was awkward at first. We looked at each other, noting the similarities, the same green eyes, the same sharp chin, the same way we all tilted our heads when we were thinking. But as we talked, the awkwardness melted into something warmer. They asked me about my life, my children, my career. They told me about growing up with James as their father, the good parts and the complicated parts. And slowly, tentatively, we began to build a relationship not based on the past, but on the potential of the future. Meanwhile, my relationship with my father, Richard, was evolving as well. The weeks following my confrontation with James were hard on both of us. Richard was hurt that I'd sought out James despite his advice not to. I was frustrated that he couldn't understand my need for answers. We had several difficult conversations where old hurts and resentments surfaced, things neither of us had acknowledged in the 33 years since he'd learned the truth about my paternity. But through those difficult conversations, something shifted. Richard finally told me things he'd never said before. How much it had hurt to know I wasn't biologically his, how hard he'd tried to treat me the same as Michael, how he'd failed at that despite his best intentions. He told me about the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he'd made the right choice to stay, if he'd done right by me or if his hurt had damaged me in ways he couldn't see. "I never wanted you to feel less loved," he told me one evening, sitting in his living room with tears streaming down his face. "You were my daughter from the moment you were born. But I won't lie and say the knowledge of your paternity didn't affect me. It did. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for every moment you felt like you weren't enough, weren't fully mine. Because you were. You always were." Those words, coming from the man who had raised me, who had been at every school play and softball game and college graduation despite the pain it must have caused him, meant everything. We hugged for a long time that evening, both of us crying, both of us finally acknowledging the elephant that had been in the room for over 3 decades. And when we pulled apart, something had healed between us. Not completely, some wounds run too deep for complete healing. But enough. Enough that we could start building a new relationship based on honesty rather than carefully maintained fiction. Michael's journey was different but no less significant. My brother had always been the responsible one, the achiever, the one who seemed to have everything figured out. But the revelation about our family's secrets had shaken him to his core. He started therapy to deal with the pressure he'd felt his entire life to be perfect, to make up for my mother's betrayal through his own achievements. He had difficult conversations with our father about the expectations that had been placed on him, and the toll they'd taken. And slowly, he began to let go of the anger he'd initially felt toward me, anger that wasn't really about me at all, but about the impossible situation our parents had created. One day, about 6 months after I'd found the diary, Michael called me. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble, "for the way I reacted when you first told me. For making you feel like this was somehow your fault. It wasn't. You're my sister and none of this changes that. Actually, it makes me appreciate you more. You lived with the effects of this secret your whole life without even knowing it existed. And you still turned out to be this amazing, strong person. I'm proud to be your brother." The changes in our family continued to unfold over the following year. I developed a tentative relationship with my half-brothers, David and Nathan. We met regularly for coffee or lunch, getting to know each other, building something new from the ashes of the secrets that had kept us apart. They introduced me to their mother, James's wife Claire, which was one of the most difficult meetings of my life. Claire looked at me with such pain in her eyes, seeing the living evidence of her husband's betrayal. But she was gracious, kinder than she had any right to be. "You're innocent in all this," she told me over tea in her immaculate living room. "You didn't ask to be born into this situation. And my sons deserve to know their sister, regardless of how that relationship came to be." As for James himself, our relationship remained complicated. We met occasionally, usually with David or Nathan present, and talked about safe topics, my children, his cases, the weather. The deep conversations we'd had in his office that first day never quite happened again. There was too much hurt, too much time lost, too many what-ifs that could never be answered. But there was acknowledgement at least. He knew I existed. He had told his family about me. And in his own way, limited as it was, he had finally taken responsibility for the choice he'd made 35 years ago to walk away from his daughter. It wasn't everything I'd hoped for when I'd confronted him, but it was more than I'd had before I'd found my mother's diary. It was something. The most unexpected consequence of revealing the family's secrets was the effect it had on my own children. My daughter, Sophia, was 13 when I told her about discovering I had a different biological father. I'd agonized over whether to tell her at all, worried about confusing or upsetting her. But I'd learned the hard way what keeping secrets could do to a family, and I was determined not to repeat my parents' mistakes. Sophia handled it better than I'd expected. "So Grandpa Richard is still Grandpa, right?" she asked after I'd explained the situation. "He's still the same person he always was?" When I confirmed that yes, nothing about Richard's role in our lives had changed, she nodded thoughtfully. "And now you have these other family members, Judge Thornton and Uncle David and Uncle Nathan, who are related to us too?" Again I confirmed. Sophia grinned. "Cool. More people for birthday presents." Her ability to accept the complexity without getting caught up in the drama was a gift I hadn't expected. A reminder that children are often more resilient and accepting than we give them credit for. My son Lucas was only 9, and I gave him a simplified version of the story. But even at his age, he understood the basic concept. Sometimes families are more complicated than they first appear, and that's okay. Both my children met their new uncles with curiosity and warmth, accepting them into our family without the baggage that made it so hard for the adults involved. Watching my children interact with David and Nathan, seeing them embrace these new family members without judgment or reservation, gave me hope. Hope that the next generation wouldn't be burdened by the secrets and lies that had defined mine. Hope that we could build something better, something healthier, something based on truth and open communication rather than carefully maintained fictions. Looking back now, 2 years after I found that diary in the attic, I can see how profoundly it changed all of our lives. It destroyed the comfortable illusions we'd all been living with, yes. It brought pain and conflict and difficult conversations that left us all exhausted and raw. But it also brought truth, brought authenticity. It brought the possibility of real relationships built on honesty rather than obligation. My relationship with my father, Richard, the man who raised me, is stronger now than it's ever been because we can finally talk about the elephant in the room. We can acknowledge the complexity of our relationship, the hurt on both sides, and the love that persisted despite everything. My relationship with Michael has deepened because we've both let go of the roles we thought we had to play and started relating to each other as the flawed, complicated humans we actually are. And my relationship with James, while it will never be what it could have been if he'd made different choices 35 years ago, exists. My children know their biological grandfather. I know my half-brothers. The truth is out, and while it's messy and complicated, it's also liberating. I no longer carry the weight of secrets I didn't even know existed. I know who I am, all of who I am, not just the carefully curated version my parents wanted me to see. I'm Richard's daughter in every way that matters, raised by a man who chose to be my father despite the pain it cost him. But I'm also James's daughter, connected by blood to a man who made terrible choices but who is finally belatedly trying to do better. I'm both and I'm neither. I'm simply Emily, and for the first time in my life that feels like enough. The diary that started it all sits in my desk drawer now. My mother's words preserved in fading ink. Sometimes I take it out and read entries at random, and I feel a complicated mix of emotions. Anger at the secrets she kept, empathy for the impossible situation she faced, grief for the woman who carried this burden alone for so long. My mother did what she thought was best to protect me from the truth. But what she didn't understand, what I hope my own children will never have to learn the hard way, is that secrets don't protect people. They trap them. They create distance where there should be intimacy, confusion where there should be clarity, hurt where there should be healing. The truth might be painful, but at least it's real. At least it gives you something solid to stand on as you figure out how to move forward. If I could go back and tell my younger self anything, it would be this. Your family is more complicated than you know, but you are more loved than you can imagine. The man who raised you did so not because he had to, but because he chose to every single day despite the pain it cost him. That's real fatherhood, not biology but choice. Not DNA but dedication. Not the ease of loving what's yours, but the courage to love what breaks your heart. Richard has been my father in every way that matters, and discovering the truth about my biological paternity hasn't changed that. If anything, it's made me appreciate him more, made me understand the depth of the commitment he made when he decided to stay and raise me as his own. But I'm also grateful in a complicated way that I found that diary. Grateful that the secrets finally came out, painful as that process was. Grateful that I got to confront James and force him to acknowledge my existence. Grateful that I met my half-brothers and started building relationships with them. Grateful that my family, all of us in our messy, complicated way, finally started telling the truth. Because the alternative, living my whole life in blissful ignorance, never knowing that the distance I felt from my father had a reason, never understanding the dynamics that had shaped my family, that would have been worse. The truth set us free, even though the process of getting there nearly destroyed us. Today my family looks different than it did 2 years ago. We're more fractured in some ways, more honest in others. Richard has started dating again, something he never did in all the years after my mother died. As if he's finally allowing himself to move on from a marriage that ended emotionally decades ago. Michael is engaged to a wonderful woman who knows all about our family's complicated history and loves him anyway. David, Nathan, and I have a group text where we share memes and make plans for holidays. James and Claire are working on their marriage and counseling, trying to rebuild trust after decades of hidden betrayal. It's messy and imperfect, and there are still hard days where old hurts resurface. But it's real. It's honest. And that's worth more than the prettiest lie ever told. I've thought a lot about my mother in these 2 years since I found her diary. I've been angry with her, grieved for her, tried to understand her impossible choices. And I've come to realize that she did the best she could with the information and resources she had. She made mistakes. Keeping secrets for so long was a mistake. Letting those secrets poison her marriage and her relationship with me was a mistake. But she also made sacrifices. She raised me, loved me, tried to protect me from the truth she thought would hurt me. She carried the weight of her choices alone for 35 years so that I wouldn't have to carry it. That was both noble and misguided, protective and destructive. She was human, flawed and complicated just like all of us. If she could see our family now, I don't know whether she'd be horrified that all her secrets came out or relieved that the burden had finally been lifted. Maybe both. But I hope she'd understand why I did what I did. Why I confronted James, why I told Richard and Michael the truth, why I insisted on dragging everything into the light. I hope she'd see that her daughter inherited her strength, even if I chose to use it differently than she did. I hope she'd be proud that I fought for the truth, even when it was painful, even when it tore apart the careful facade she'd spent a lifetime constructing. The attic where I found the diary has been emptied now. I sold my childhood home 6 months ago, unable to live in a place that held so many memories of a family that never really existed the way I thought it did. But before I closed the door for the last time, I went up to that attic one more time. I stood in the empty space where I'd found the diary, where my entire life had changed in the space of a few hours, and I whispered a thank you to my mother. Thank you for writing it all down. Thank you for leaving me a way to find the truth, even if it wasn't the truth you wanted me to find. Thank you for loving me, even if that love was complicated by secrets and shame and regret. And thank you for raising me to be strong enough to handle the truth when I finally found it. As I walked out of that empty house for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of unknown secrets, of unspoken truths, of questions I didn't even know I had. All of it had been lifted. What I carried now was different. The weight of knowledge, of complicated family relationships, of truths that were messy and uncomfortable but real. And that weight, heavy as it was, felt more honest, more bearable, more mine. I uncovered my mother's diary in the attic, and my family's lies came tumbling out. But in the rubble of those lies we found something more valuable. The truth. And with the truth came the possibility of real healing, real relationships, real love. Not the sanitized, picture-perfect version my mother had tried so hard to maintain, but the complicated, messy, beautiful reality of a family that finally stopped hiding and started being honest with each other. Would I go back and not read the diary if I could? Would I choose to remain in ignorant bliss rather than face the painful truths I discovered? I've asked myself that question 100 times over the past 2 years. And every time my answer is the same: no. Because the truth, painful as it was to discover, gave me something I'd been missing my whole life without knowing it. It gave me wholeness. It gave me understanding. It gave me the ability to know myself fully, not just the parts my parents decided I should see. And it gave me the courage to live my own life with honesty and authenticity, to make sure my children never have to uncover painful secrets in an attic someday, because I had the courage to tell them the truth from the beginning. The diary is closed now, its secrets revealed, its burden lifted. But the story it started is still being written. In the relationships we're building, in the healing we're doing, in the choices we make every day to be honest with each other, even when it's hard. My family's lies came tumbling out that day in the attic. And from their ruins we're building something new, something stronger, something truer, something worth the pain it cost to get here. That's the real story. Not the secrets themselves, but what we did after they were revealed. Not the lies, but the truth that finally set us free.